What is the influence of being involved in a very stressful work environment or a difficult relationship? All of these factors are exquisitely important because they relate to our metabolism. They can have a profound effect on blood sugar. We know that stress, for example, amplifies a certain chemical called cortisol, a hormone that has an important role to play in blood sugar directly, but also indirectly through the changes that cortisol induces within the gut and the gut microbiome. Downstream effects include metabolic issues that can raise blood sugar. So we shouldn't overlook other important lifestyle choices that we can be making, like getting a good and restorative night's sleep in terms of keeping our blood sugar under control. And that's a real call out for knowing then what is the effect of these lifestyle choices or the changes that we make on our blood sugar. How wonderful that we can continuously measure that with this new technology.
Welcome to the Woman's Doctor podcast, helping empower women to embrace their body and soul's full potential. I'm your host, Dr. Trevor Cates, and after 22 years of working with patients, I found the answers to our health struggles are much deeper than most people realize. To help explore this, I'm interviewing colleagues and other wellness experts to get to the root cause so women can realize their true beauty and be informed decision makers for themselves and their loved ones. Your gut, brain, and hormones are more connected than most people realize. To help us better understand this connection, I'm sharing an interview with Dr. David Perlmutter, who is a board-certified neurologist and 6 times New York Times best-selling author. Dr. Perlmutter has published extensively in peer-reviewed scientific journals, including the Archives of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and the Journal of Applied Nutrition. In addition, he is a frequent lecturer at events sponsored by institutions such as the World Bank, Columbia University, New York University, and Harvard University. You may recall his interview from the Hormones, Health, and Harmony docu-series. His interview was over 2 hours long, but only parts of the interview made it into the series. So I wanted to share some of his wisdom in today's podcast. We cover the difference between a hormone and a neurotransmitter, how these chemical messengers impact mood, and why women are more prone to certain types of mood issues. And he explains which lifestyle choices are key for our mood and memory. He also covers important things to know about the gut-brain connection and which dietary changes are essential for brain health. For example, do you have to give up gluten or all grains? As you'll see, Dr. Perlmutter is a fantastic educator. You can also watch the entire 2-hour interview when you purchase the Hormones docuseries at hormoneseries.com. For now, I hope you enjoy this podcast. What do you think is essential to know about the brain?
What really matters most to me is focusing on what lets people get sick in the first place. Especially in the field of neurology, there's not a whole lot that can be done once people begin to fail. So it's really all about identifying the underlying mechanisms that leads to neurologic decline. And these days, I think it's become more and more clear that major processes like inflammation are playing a big role. So we have to ask ourselves, what is it about our lifestyle choices that are literally, by definition of the name, inflammation, fanning the flames of that very process that makes a good brain go bad?
What is the difference between a hormone and a neurotransmitter?
So in a very real sense, hormones and neurotransmitters are actually quite similar because they affect cell function. There are receptors that live on cell surfaces that both bind hormones and cause the cell to change its activity. And similarly, neurotransmitters bind to specific receptors, typically on the other end of a neuron that causes that neuron to do something. So in a real sense, these are both sources of information that instruct a cell in terms of what it should do. Now, we look at the neurotransmitters as being those chemicals that are involved in the functionality of the brain. And the reality is that neurotransmitters work throughout the body. And I must say that similarly, so do hormones. And we tend to pigeonhole these notions of what neurotransmitters do. There's a happy neurotransmitter, call it serotonin. There are other neurotransmitters that function in terms of how you will ultimately have cognitive outcome, things like dopamine and norepinephrine. But the reality is that context really matters. The context of how these neurotransmitters work in ratio to other neurotransmitters, and really in context of where it is that they are acting. And the reality of the situation is we do the same thing with hormones. We tend to want to pigeonhole hormones, like consider progesterone to be for gestation, and therefore that wouldn't have any role to play, for example, in a male, and nothing could be further from the truth. Similarly, testosterone is a fundamentally important hormone in women, in their metabolism and things like their reproductive function, and even in things like libido. So I think that the take-home message is we really have to broaden our understanding of what the information sources are in the human body, and recognize that what is happening within the human body influences these activities in terms of context. And I'll mention one last, more up-to-date level of information I think that has a huge bearing on both hormone function and neurotransmitter function. And it has to do with the interrelationship of the human body with the resident gut bacteria. We're now looking at wonderful data that indicates that the state of function, if you will, of the gut bacteria plays a very important role in how hormones work, and certainly how the neurotransmitters work. And in fact, as it relates to neurotransmitters, we know that to a significant degree, even the production of certain neurotransmitters depends upon health and vitality of specific organisms living within the gut. And why that really matters on both counts, hormones and neurotransmitters, is because we influence the state of the health of our gut bacteria significantly, moment to moment, by our lifestyle choices. Meaning that when we choose to eat in a certain way or get enough sleep or not, that we are influencing the health and diversity and functionality of our gut bacteria, and therefore downstream, we are affecting the metabolism of their products, and therefore the functionality of hormones and even neurotransmitters.
Do certain neurotransmitters play a role in mood?
So in terms of neurotransmitter function, first, let me take a step back and say, I think that the relationship of mood and even behavior is less influenced by any particular neurotransmitter than perhaps modern pharmacology would like us to believe. Depression is not a state of serotonin deficiency, and therefore that speaks to the efficacy, for example, of the SSRI drugs that are so-called designed to allow serotonin to be more effective within the brain and therefore elevate the mood. I think context, yet again, is extremely important. And in this regard, context has to do with the balance of neurotransmitters and really some underlying genetics that involve each individual's metabolism of those neurotransmitters. And really, the gut plays a fundamental role. Now, there's an important relationship between how neurotransmitters function and their levels related to state of health or other aspects of hormonal function and hormonal levels. And therefore, we do anticipate to see significant interactions between hormones and neurotransmitters.
Are women more likely to have certain types of mood issues?
So women, in fact, are more likely to have various types of mood disorders. And I think it may relate to several factors. Certainly, there are changes in hormones that happen during menstruation that are significantly playing a role. But I think there may be some more fundamental genetic issues that relate to being XX versus XY. We know that women have a 2-to-1 increased risk of, for example, autoimmune conditions. So I think it gets down to the notion of immune function and therefore regulation of this fundamental process of inflammation. We now really strongly believe that there is a powerful tie-in between this mechanism, inflammation, and, for example, depression. We know that higher levels of inflammatory mediators are seen in individuals who are depressed. We know that we can induce depression in an individual by injecting into that person chemicals that augment these inflammatory mediators. And we know that typically as part of being sick, a time when your body is more inflamed, is associated with the sickness phenotype, where you do, in fact, feel more depressed. It's hard to imagine what the adaptive advantage of that would have been in ancestral times. But nonetheless, those conditions of increased inflammation and hyperactivity of the immune system, which are more characteristic of women, might well explain the higher incidence of mood disorders in women.
Which lifestyle choices impact our mood?
We're in the very beginning of understanding how our lifestyle choices impact our risk for mood disorders, and even taking it further, the ability of making specific lifestyle choices and changes that can impact an existing mood disorder. When we circle back and revisit the notion that depression, for example, is primarily related to inflammation, then we should ask ourselves, well, what are those lifestyle choices that are then associated with decreasing that activity, with turning the fire down, reducing inflammation? I think the best place to start is to gain an understanding that the set point of inflammation is hugely governed by what is going on within the gut. We know that, for example, our gut bacteria have as one of their assigned tasks the maintenance of the gut lining. When our gut bacteria are less effective in maintaining the integrity of this gut barrier, then that gut barrier becomes more permeable, call it leaky gut if you will, because our gut bacteria are less functional in terms of keeping it repaired. And that takes us back to then, how do we go about caring for our gut bacteria to maintain the integrity of the gut lining so that we have an entry point for lowering inflammation, because inflammation is related to depression. Now, that might sound like a lot of dots to connect, but the reality is eating right for the gut can help with mood. And the data that is supportive of that is very nascent and, in fact, very sparse. But I'm looking more towards the future because I know the research is happening right now. We know that researchers like Dr. Emran Mayer at UCLA are exploring this in great depth, looking at this relationship between alterations of the human diet and actual changes, hopefully improvement in mood. He actually has performed in his lab an interventional trial in women, in humans, giving them a certain type of probiotic that contained a certain strain of bacteria associated with decreased inflammation, and lo and behold, their worldview actually changed. Now, that is profound, to think that a simple intervention like giving a group of individuals a specific type of bacteria contained in a yogurt changed their view of the world is profound. It really sets the stage for dietary and other lifestyle interventions to be ultimately powerful tools, one hopes, that can be used adjunctively along with pharmacotherapy to help this ever-increasing issue that we have with depression.
Do monthly changes in women's hormones impact mood?
These days, we would expect, when you look at how our bodies have evolved over however long you want to take it, hundreds of thousands of years, you would think that the monthly shifts in hormones shouldn't be associated with any significant dysfunction. But the reality is, when you really try to unpack that a little bit, you would realize that there should be times of the month a woman's mood should in fact change, that there should be times of the month when a woman should feel better about herself, more wanting to be interactive and have a higher sense of libido. That would tend to attract a mate, and that would tend to enhance the process of getting pregnant and propagation of the species. So the whole notion that mood would change during the process, the time period of the menstrual month, in that lens does in fact make a heck of a lot of sense. And we do recognize then that variations in hormones, and certainly variations in ratios of hormones, the peaking out of progesterone, the estrogen spike followed by the estrogen decline that occurs during the normal course of menstruation, all have important roles to play in regulating mood and in regulating exactly how a woman feels about the world around her and feels about herself as well. So we should expect that. Now, I would say that now we're understanding in our modern world that there are significant changes that are fairly widespread with respect to hormone levels in women. And a lot of that can be seen to be related to modern lifestyle. For example, A diet that has become so pervasive, higher in simple carbohydrates, sugars, and highly processed food, is a diet that tends to raise blood sugar, and as a consequence of that, raises insulin. Now, there's going to be a little unpacking that I do here, and may sound a little complicated, but I'm hoping I can make it simple. So, dietary changes that increase insulin change the levels and the effectiveness of something called insulin binding, the effectiveness and the availability of insulin, and also affect the function of what's called sex hormone binding globulin or protein. What I'm saying is that higher levels of blood sugar, a higher carbohydrate diet, ultimately can compromise how hormones work by virtue of their ability to be free. Hormones work when they're unbound from these binding proteins. Higher levels of insulin affect the binding of hormones to these proteins and affects how effective they are. So while it's well and good, for example, to look at a total testosterone level in the blood, what we really want to look at is the free testosterone, because that's the testosterone, as an example, that is the active form. The level of the free testosterone is highly influenced ultimately by blood sugar and therefore is diet related. So these days, when we see so much higher levels of, for example, testosterone that we see in women who have something called PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, where their mood is significantly disrupted, where this is the most common cause of infertility in America today, we can relate that back to the diet by virtue of this mechanism.
What role does blood sugar play in brain health?
We live in a very, very exciting time where people are becoming empowered with knowledge. And I think from my world, what is the most empowering bit of knowledge that people are gaining is an understanding of their metabolism, specifically their blood sugar levels. And as a neurologist, this is a absolute fundamental. Let me give you a couple of reasons for that last statement. First, we know that if you become a type 2 diabetic, you will as much as quadruple your risk for an untreatable condition that is called Alzheimer's disease or senile dementia of the Alzheimer's type. Despite the fact that we've recently seen an Alzheimer's drug finally get FDA approval, that would certainly be part of another conversation. Yeah, it would be great if we had a treatment for this disease, but we don't. So we should emphasize prevention. And prevention in the context of quadrupling your risk when you become a type 2 diabetic means don't become a type 2 diabetic. Gain an understanding as to what is elevating your blood sugar early on in life, and then make those modifications that you've learned about that can keep your blood sugar under control. A fascinating study appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2016, in which they took a group of several thousand, 3,000 plus individuals, and they did a very, very extensive examination of these individuals at the beginning of the study. What did they do? They measured their fasting blood sugar. End of story. Well, they also did a neurocognitive test. They followed these individuals for several years, and they determined who had cognitive decline and who did not. They found a very direct correlation between those individuals who had elevation of their blood sugar at the beginning of the study and risk for cognitive decline. That's very powerful. And what is even more powerful, take-home message, is that the level of blood sugar that was correlated with cognitive decline was began at around 105. And that'll raise your eyebrows because, most people go to a doctor, your blood sugar is 105 and everybody seems to be happy. Well, it tells us that what we consider to be our goals as in the normal range isn't really good enough vis-a-vis our conversation right now. We need to be in the optimal range, and that means one heck of a lot lower than 105. So blood sugar, moment to moment, day by day, year by year, plays a profound role in keeping the brain healthy. When we elevate our blood sugar persistently, we develop ultimately something called insulin resistance. And there are profound and multiple downstream effects of insulin resistance that are exquisitely detrimental to the brain and pave the way for brain decline across a spectrum of named diseases, Alzheimer's certainly being the most common and well recognized. Insulin is important in the brain, first of all, from a bioenergetic perspective, to allowing sugar, glucose, to get into the brain across the blood-brain barrier. But insulin within the brain plays other important roles that are perhaps less well recognized, including functioning as what we call a trophic hormone, meaning it's the kind and loving chemical for brain neurons. It keeps them happy. It keeps them functional. It allows them to recover from trauma, for example, more rapidly. Insulin is degraded in the brain, oddly enough, by an enzyme called insulin-degrading enzyme. Who knew? An insulin-degrading enzyme has one other interesting function. It is the chemical, the enzyme within the brain, that the brain uses to degrade some other protein called beta amyloid. Now, I would say many people have heard of this beta amyloid. That's the chemical, the protein that accumulates in the brain and seems to be associated to some degree with Alzheimer's. So keeping our blood sugars under control, and for most people that means keeping them lower than they already are, is really job one if you want to protect your brain moving forward. And the last thing I will say that I think is fundamentally important in this discussion is this attention to keeping our blood sugar where it needs to be. This needs to start happening not when we're starting to forget Wi-Fi codes and grandchildren's names. This is something we need to start paying attention to in our 20s and 30s. That's when these damaging processes begin, which become feed forward. They make themselves worse over time. So it's not that helpful to start paying attention to this in our 60s and 70s when we're noticing that we're starting to fail. Once we are reaching that point of subjective cognitive impairment before we reach MCI or mild cognitive impairment, there is storm clouds on the horizon, if you will. There's trouble ahead. So we've got to be as preemptive and proactive as we possibly can and get blood sugar control taken care of even during adolescence.
What are other contributors to blood sugar issues?
No doubt sugar in the diet and other aspects of the diet I think are really very important. Protein, for example. Even overdoing protein can ultimately lead to increase in blood sugar. But it's really valuable to explore the panorama as it relates to lifestyle choices and how they relate to blood sugar. And I have to segue for a moment to the notion of what we call continuous glucose monitoring. This is a tool that people have access to that can tell them what is the influence of dietary choices on blood sugar moment to moment. Well, we've covered that. But what is the influence of how I slept last night, of the exercise I got this morning, or the exercise that I didn't get? What is the influence of being involved in a very stressful work environment? Or a difficult relationship. All of these factors are exquisitely important because they relate to our metabolism. They can have a profound effect on blood sugar. We know that stress, for example, amplifies a certain chemical called cortisol, a hormone that has an important role to play in blood sugar directly, but also indirectly through the changes that cortisol induces within the gut and the gut microbiome. Downstream effects include metabolic issues that can raise blood sugar. So we shouldn't overlook other important lifestyle choices that we can be making, like getting a good and restorative night's sleep in terms of keeping our blood sugar under control. And that's a real call out for knowing then what is the effect of these lifestyle choices or the changes that we make on our blood sugar. How wonderful that we can continuously measure that with this new technology.
What do you find is gluten's impact on the brain?
Many years ago, I wrote a book called Grain Brain, and that book was about the impact of a higher refined carbohydrate diet, sugars being toxic to the brain. And we also explored deeply, with the level of science that was available to us at that time, how a protein found in wheat, barley, and rye, called gluten, could amplify some of these mechanisms that could be threatening to the brain. I, at that time, reviewed a lot of research from a Dr. Marius Hadjivassiliou from England, who was correlating gluten exposure in non-celiac patients. I'll talk about that in just a moment, and relating certain issues related to the central nervous system and even peripheral nervous system being related in some individuals to their exposure to this protein found in, as I mentioned, wheat, barley, and rye. and found that in some individuals, restricting them from that protein led to improvement. Well, since that time, we've seen mainstream medicine, as published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, identify something called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Now, we have known for decades about a disease, an autoimmune condition affecting 2 to 3% of humanity called celiac disease. And celiac disease is a condition in which people develop an autoimmune disease related to changes in their gut lining and therefore more inflammation when these unique group of people, genetic predisposition, are exposed to this protein. The news then that was published in JAMA described this non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which now has been described as possibly affecting 40 to 60% of humanity. And the number seems to be increasing with time. We can explore why that might be in just a moment. But these are individuals who don't have the autoimmune condition called celiac disease, but who nonetheless have negative reactions when they are exposed to gluten, primarily in the diet. And when we look at the vast array of food products, processed food products, that have added gluten, though we might not suspect that, it's no wonder then that people can have negative issues related to a variety of different types of foods when they are consumed that can affect various parts of the body, from the brain to the gut to the skin. So I think it's real important that we gain a much broader understanding of this gluten sensitivity issue as it relates to the entire body, and certainly, getting back to the original question, as it relates to the brain. When we see research that shows individuals who are gluten sensitive showing symptoms and even brain scans that mimic a disease like multiple sclerosis, it's really important that we take notice. When we see individuals, and actually published a study on this, with long-standing headaches, in the case of the study we published, 30 years worth of debilitating opiate-requiring migraine headaches being virtually cured going gluten-free, I think it's really so valuable to look at that as a possibility in anyone. There's no upside to eating gluten, so why not consider restricting it? Because you might just be rewarded with better health, and vis-a-vis the question, you might be rewarded with health as it relates to your brain.
Is the problem all grains or just gluten?
So after we wrote Grain Brain, I think that Dr. Perlmutter, yours truly, was kind of labeled as the anti-grain doctor, the anti-grain book. And that was never the intention. What our intention is to call out those gluten-containing grains, but saying that, there is a place if you want to eat the grains that are comfortable for you. Like, for example, a grain is a seed of grass by definition, and rice and corn, for example, are by definition grains. They are not gluten-containing. And I think within the context of making good choices, we would look at corn, we would look at rice through the lenses of other ideas. Are they non-GMO? Do they have higher levels of arsenic? Those things are consideration for corn and rice respectively. But we could say that these could be good choices in moderation. Most importantly, looking at the fact that these are pretty potent sources of carbohydrate, how might they be affecting your blood sugar? The other very important leg of the stool as it relates to brain health.
What are the main things that contribute to gut dysbiosis issues?
Gut dysbiosis, kind of a nebulous term. What may be bad in terms of the array and functionality of with respect to my gut bacteria might be different from another person. So I think first, that whole notion of gut dysbiosis has got to be relative and has got to be contextual. But that said, we do know that there are some broad-reaching principles here of things that can be threatening to the diversity and functionality of our gut bacteria. And I think there are lots of them. We could start with glyphosate residues in our food. We know that by and large, the reason that we have genetically modified seeds is to allow farmers to then spray the crops with poison to kill the weeds. That poison is generally glyphosate, the active ingredient in a product called Roundup. And I've often thought that, if an alien could come down to Earth and would be wondering why we're suffering the way we are with respect to our health, which we are, I think the first question that said alien would ask would be, you mean you're spraying the food that you eat with poison? And I think when you confront that reality in that form of a question, you really do take a step back. Why are we spraying our food with poison? Well, here's how it all evolved. Glyphosate was determined to only affect a certain chemical pathway, the shikimate pathway, found in bacteria. And also this would kill weeds because it can affect how plants work. So it was thought that we can spray it on the food that we eat, no issue, because absolutely we're not bacteria, and why should we care? We don't have that biochemical pathway. Well, it turns out why that is flawed is that many of the especially good bacteria living within our bodies that do good things like make B vitamins, that maintain the lining of our gut, that help manufacture neurotransmitters, as examples, that we need for our health, they are sensitive. They have the shikimate pathway, and they can be damaged by residual glyphosate that is in our food. This is the food that is GMO. This is the food that comes from the seeds that are treated in such a way such that farmers can spray this poison on the very food that we eat. So I think as an overriding principle, avoiding genetically modified foods, not because there's necessarily something inherent in the gene modification, but again, because the GMO part of the story generally allows the spraying of the food with poison. And I can never get through saying that without having a pause in my voice because it's so profound. Now, beyond that, what do we use to sterilize our swimming pools? We use chlorine. And guess what? Chlorine is used to sterilize municipal water systems, the water that we drink. And we're going to kill bacteria with chlorinated water that gets into our bodies when we drink that chlorinated water. I think important issues beyond diet, now I want to segue to, are the drugs that we take. We know that some of the most commonly used drugs, like the acid-blocking drugs, these commonly prescribed and even over-the-counter acid-blocking drugs that we think we need to take if we have indigestion when we eat a certain horrendous type of food. If you watch the commercials, these have profound effects on the health and functionality of our gut bacteria. Similarly, we know that there's an effect even of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Yes, drugs like ibuprofen, so commonly used, prescribed, taken over the counter, significantly affect the gut bacteria. And not to mention, which makes no sense because I'm going to mention it, to mention antibiotics. Antibiotics do exactly that. Anti against bio, meaning life, in this case, bacteria. Now, to be clear, there's a time and a place for an antibiotic. I think that we know antibiotics can be life-saving. I'm not derogating their use in that context. But to go into a doctor's office with a sniffle and walk out with a prescription for an incredibly powerful, wide-spectrum antibiotic, which is really what we would expect, I mean, we're going to feel as if we've not received the level of service that we expected, and if we don't walk out of there with something. You know, a pat on the back saying, you know, you're going to get over this, give it some time, is really generally for a cold the best advice. Yet we get these powerful prescriptions, and they are weapons of mass microbial destruction as it relates to our gut bacteria.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Woman's Doctor podcast, be sure to share it with the women in your life and rate and review the show. And to learn all about balancing your hormones, join us for the Hormones, Health, and Harmony 9-part documentary series at hormoneseries.com.